Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. That's a pretty powerful trailer there, Mr. Freeman.
Thanks, sir.
I'd like to take this moment to thank the whole team for taking this journey and for lending Morgan's voice to the history of the 761st Tank Battalion. And, as you know, it is quite a voice. So, Morgan, it's great to have you here. Although, around here, to be honest with you, the whole deep, smooth voice thing, that's really my thing. But on a serious note, all Americans should be inspired by the story of the 761st Tank Battalion, a unit known as the Black Panthers. It's an incredible story and a deeply American story. This battalion earned its place in our history alongside the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, and the Tuskegee Airmen. The 761st had to train to fight Hitler while surrounded by the racist restrictions of the Jim Crow South. But they persisted. And in 1944, they finally saw combat when they took back a German-held town in France. And one of their commanders remembered, "My men were tigers. They fought like seasoned veterans. We got our lumps, and we took that town." And I should say that the commander included another word in his comment right before the word town, which anyone who served in combat, you can figure out what that word might have been. Now, during World War II, black troops called for a double victory, for liberation overseas and for liberty at home. And that has some important echoes now. 75 years ago last week, President Truman signed the executive order that finally integrated the U.S. military. Ending segregation in the U.S. military made us a stronger force, and it made America more noble and more whole. It's one reason why my own life journey could take me from growing up in the Jim Crow South to serving as Secretary of Defense. And it's one key reason why President Biden can nominate an outstanding warfighter like Air Force General C.Q. Brown to be our next chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Today, our military draws on the talents and strengths of all Americans, regardless of color or creed. And that's why the United States has the strongest fighting force in history. So we owe a special debt today to the men of the 761st Tank Battalion. Their story doesn't just inspire us to serve our country, it inspires us to stand up for its founding ideals. So to Morgan and your whole team, thank you for bringing this important story to new audiences. And once again, sir, thank you for being here. Shock treatment associated with this, is there?
Thank you.
Well, again, sir, thanks for being here. And I just, with your permission, I'd just like to ask you a couple of questions about what this means to you. You've been working this project for a long time, and you're very, very committed to telling this story, and I just want to know why it was important to you to tell the story of the 761st. And as you did that, is there anything that surprised you?
No, nothing that surprised me. People hear about black soldiers, how they comport themselves, yada, yada, yada. That's not amazing, just the way it is. The history of blacks in the military, war, has always been, I mean, it's always been heroic, from the Revolutionary War to today. The big difference is who knows about it, and what do you know about it? Now, we did Glory, and I had people tell me they wept when they saw that, because they had no idea, people grew up, particularly in the South, thinking that all we did was chop cotton and drive mules. That's the history and the legacy of blacks in America. I grew up going to the movies. I learned history from the movies. One of the things wrong with me learning history in the movies was that didn't see me. That bothered me. Still bothers me. But if I want my story told, I have to tell it, don't I? And that's my mantra. If you want your story told, you got to tell it.
Well, we all look forward to seeing and hearing that story being told, and so thanks for your commitment to this project. A lot of people are going to learn a lot about this great unit. And by the way, Glory is still one of my favorite films, and I think there's probably a bunch of other folks in the room who would say the same thing. Just extremely well done, and so thanks for bringing that to all of us. Morgan, as I said in my opening, and I know you were at Howard last week, we just marked the 75th anniversary of President Truman signing the executive order, and that order was 9981, and that desegregated the military. We both know progress has been made, but there's more to be done. So I'd like to ask you, in terms of how you see things, where do you think we are today, and how do you see this?
You mean in the military or just in America?
We'll start with the military, and then we'll go to America.
Well, obviously, I mean, I'm sitting here, I'm looking at our military, and yeah, this is America. This is it. Now, if the rest of the world, rest of our country, gets on board, we'll be world beaters. World beaters. Socially, economically, militarily, however you want to look at it. Because if you said, as a fighting force, with the best in the world, as a country, we want to be the best in the world. That's how I see it.
And so I would absolutely agree with you that we are a diverse military. That's what we're all about. We reflect the country that we serve. And we're going to continue to make sure our leaders reflect the military that they lead. Unknown to some people, Morgan, you actually served in uniform.
Yes, I did.
And you were in the United States Air Force?
I was.
But you've also served by telling stories like this. What is your advice for young people who would look to serve or who are thinking about serving?
I don't think there is anybody who gets into the military and doesn't benefit. I learned so much in that 3 years, 8 months, and 10 days. What part of that was funny? 3 years, 8 months, and 10 days? Yeah. Y'all want to hear an anecdote about me in the military? Why I wasn't fit?
Sure, go for it.
I was assigned to radar maintenance. Now, I'm about as mechanical as a bug. But there was a young man in the office. I came out of high school being able to type 65 words a minute. So this young man in the office had a girlfriend who was way, way, way too young, and he got arrested. So I volunteered because me and an Underwood typewriter were close friends. And I could compose letters, I could better at that than at radar maintenance. So one day we get a new sergeant in, 2 rockers, deck, black. I have a captain who was white. This sergeant checks in, he's just come in from Thule, Greenland. Sergeant Spaulding, I want you to meet one of my best men. Your best man is the one who volunteers. So I go in there, and I say, Sergeant, it's nice to meet you. I'm sure you keep your nose clean. We'll get on all right. He had an eyebrow that could touch his hairline. He said, you want to take this box up to the 6th tower? No. I'm a 2-striper. There's the captain sitting right there. What'd you say? I said, no. The fuck? The captain sitting right here, his name was Charles F. Ledger. He just kept his head down. And this sergeant couldn't figure out what he was going to do. Slap me or what? So just before he decided, I said, Sergeant, if you want me to take this box up to the 6th tower, you tell me to do it, it's gone. But you asked me if I wanted to, and the answer is still no. We became tight. He never forgot that lesson.
Well, Mr. Freeman, I'm getting a hook here from the general, but I want to thank you again for this tremendous piece of work, and we all look forward to seeing it in full. Also, thank you for your service to our country, and thank you for your continued service in telling the American story. And we are really, really grateful for all that you do. So,
I will continue
God bless
as
you.
long as I can get out of bed.
Well, Mr. Freeman, Mr. Secretary, thank you both for that very interesting and very important discussion. We're thankful to both of you for your time today. And as you depart for the audience, we will show another clip from the documentary.
Thank you.
Please.
Take any seat.
Yes, sir. Now I'm pleased to welcome Mr. Freeman back to the stage with our other panelists, Mr. Phil Bertelson, Director, Mr. Charles Bowery, Executive Director, U.S. Army Center of Military History, and Mr. James Younger, Executive Producer. Let's give them a round of applause. Okay, well, gentlemen, I'll jump right in with a few questions at the top. We'll start with Mr. Freeman, and then anyone feel free to jump in. Sir, it struck me that despite the way that the members of the 761st were treated back home here in the United States, they all went overseas to Europe to fight for our country. In your research and the interviews that you did, what did you learn about the soldiers, and what was their motivation to do that?
To do what?
To go fight for their country.
I don't know what motivates men to go into harm's way, but there have been blacks fighting for the United States since the Revolutionary War. What motivates, I don't know, to tell you the truth. God and country. Where are you going to go if you don't? I mean, this was always, talking about this country, it always had that constitution that all men are created equal part of the Constitution, endowed with inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We buy that. Everybody buys that. All Americans buy it. That concept is worth fighting for. We all know it. So I think I'm making this shit up, mind you, but that's my belief.
Turning to the production of this story, Mr. Burleson or Mr. Younger, this story has so many elements, whether it was the racism or segregation that the 761st experienced, the 2 years in training, which is pretty intense, the combat record, and then their experiences after the war. How did you approach telling this story, and did you find a common theme throughout all of those different threads?
Thanks for the question. This story came to me through Mr. Freeman and Mr. Younger and Ms. McCreary, and I'm just very grateful to have had the opportunity. And it was not a story I knew very well, but the closer I looked, the more I realized that there was a lot more to this story than just some men who got in a tank and fought the Nazis. And it became a real passion of mine to know more about the lives that they lived before they went into battle and after. And I think to your question earlier, it was a group of men that really found this opportunity to represent a country that they felt would live up to its ideals given the chance, and they set out to prove that in their fighting, in their training, and that's really what motivated them. Honestly, I think to go from second-class citizens to full citizenship, and they fought valiantly to do that, and came home, unfortunately, and were not received as heroes, that motivated them even further. Many of them got active in a burgeoning civil rights movement at the time and fought for their civil rights. And so there's a kind of long legacy of fighting for your human rights and fighting fascism abroad to come home and fight racism. And eventually they were recognized for all of that. So we were grateful to have the opportunity to tell it all, because without the context of the world in which they lived, that their valiant efforts abroad would probably be lost or understated.
Great, thank you.
I was just to add to that there's this window of opportunity of telling the story was closing in the fact that the last 2 or 3 members of the 761st are alive, only just. I mean, there's Robert Andre, who's 98 years old now. There's a couple of other people who are not well enough really to talk, so that wanting to capture before the chance is gone, that direct oral history from the survivors and from many of the children and grandchildren of the survivors, like to hear what was passed down. And that was some of your organizing principle of the film, is that it really would be told as much as possible through that first person or handed down first person testimony.
Yeah, fascinating. And you highlight the recognition. I think ultimately 300 Purple Hearts, 11 Silver Stars, and a Medal of Honor out of this one unit. It's pretty amazing. Mr. Bowery, from a historical standpoint, how do you see the actions of the 761st ultimately impacting the U.S. military that we have today?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think starting with one of the things that Mr. Freeman said and what Secretary Austin alluded to is that throughout our history, military service has been a core part of citizenship. And so black soldiers have fought to demonstrate their citizenship and throughout our history. What the 761st and other units like it did was incredibly important because one of the core ideas of Jim Crow, of segregation, was that black people could not perform in combat, that they could not take up a weapon and serve in harm's way. And in fact, there were studies after, for example, after World War I, the Army War College commissioned a study that said, with scientific basis, that black soldiers could not be trusted to serve in combat units. They didn't possess the mental or physical attributes to undergo that responsibility and to serve in harm's way. So what units like the 761st, which is a combat arms unit, it's an armor battalion, a tank battalion, what they did was demonstrate that this was nonsense. And those statistics bear it out. 300 Purple Hearts. So a third of the unit's strength wounded in combat, a Medal of Honor. And I'll add to that a Presidential Unit Citation. Those aren't just given out like paper. A PUC for this 761st Tank Battalion for 180 days, 6 months straight in combat. And so, in particular, I'm interested in the degree to which these combat arms units, full of infantry and armor and artillery soldiers, demonstrated full citizenship, and they really put that double V campaign into action. And I think that established the idea that the concept of a segregated unit was just nonsense. It was a non-starter. And what they did was lay the groundwork as we move forward in the country's history to the Korean War era, in which black soldiers, under the stresses and strains of combat in Korea, when the force required replacements, particularly in the early days of the war, the U.S. Army issues a call for black soldiers who were serving in segregated labor units behind the lines, construction units, logistics units, to volunteer to serve as infantrymen in combat. And they enlisted in large numbers. And they were responsible for turning that tide in the Korean War. And that process of demonstrating their fitness for combat and citizenship really begins with units like the 761st.
Great, thank you. Now, Mr. Freeman, you've talked about your uncle's service. As you were working on this documentary, what was it like learning more about your uncle? What was it like learning more about the military that he had served in?
Big surprise. Because when I was like 7 years old, I somehow got the information that one of my uncles was MIA in the Pacific. So I grew up thinking, oh yeah, one of my uncles MIA in the Pacific. Yeah. Turns out that wasn't so at all, thanks to these guys. So I had my biological father, my stepfather, and two uncles all served in the Army. But one thing that I learned, and this is from that term, the fog of war, soldiers who have been in combat don't come back bragging or even able to seriously sit down and talk about it, unless, of course, it's among themselves. But you can't do it with civilians, people who've never been in that kind of situation. Any minute it's over.
Thank you. We've talked about sort of your approach to producing and filming this documentary, but can you talk a little bit about what some of the challenges were, especially given the fact that we're talking about a unit that fought over 70 years ago?
Well, I'll start and say that, often with history, it's the challenge is finding the evidence, finding enough visual material to tell the story in an interesting way. And that also begins with who's left to tell the story. And we were fortunate enough, as James said, to have a surviving member of the 761st who could help us go back to those days in battle, and his descendants and those who were descended of other veterans. So the biggest challenge is really the collection of the history and assembling it in a way that feels complete and honest, yeah, entertaining too, to some extent.
Yeah, I think that what kind of ties this story together in a way is this telling the story is so important, because people, as you said, Morgan, people who come back from war often don't tell their own story. They don't want to tell their own story. The day that we filmed with Robert Andre, he's 98 years old now, 97 at the time, and with his family, who, you know, are all very much, I mean, his son has been supporting him, going out and, you know, to events and commemorations for many years. But he said on the day that we spent, 1 hour talking with Morgan, he heard things he'd never heard before about his father's action. And you think, how does someone not talk about that for 80 years, 70 years? 70 years.
All that time, he was having shrapnel. Come on, you know how like something would work its way out. Shrapnel would work its way out of his body.
Yeah. But this is why I think that it's so. I mean, you should say this, but also comment on this, that recognition by the military, by the country that you fought for, is important, because it shouldn't be on the combatants themselves to have to tell the story. It should be documented. They deserve that for having gone through the battle, gone through all the trauma of war, to be recognized and to be properly documented.
What was his reaction when you showed up and said, "We're making a documentary about the 761st"?
You know, his son was pretty much his caretaker in that regard, and he was a very reluctant witness. And often when you're telling stories, the reluctant witness is the best, if you can somehow convince them to share. And so when they heard that Mr. Freeman was willing to pay them a visit, they changed their minds. So that's how that happened. And to the point of the shrapnel, his son used this really poetic term, and hearing the story and hearing elements of the story for the first time, he said, "It's a lot like the shrapnel that's still revealing itself out of my father's body. These elements of the story that I'd never heard are coming to the fore." So we were really pleased to have the opportunity to meet him and to talk about the recognition, the delayed recognition in many ways. And we knew there was a presidential unit citation offered to this unit, but it was in 1978 under President Carter, 30 plus years after they were in the theater of war. And it took an effort of veterans and lobbyists to champion that, and they ultimately got that recognition. So,
Mr. Bowery, you talked earlier about sort of the change in perceptions as it related to Black Americans serving in the military. But can you help us put into broader context what factors led to President Truman signing the executive order that ultimately desegregated the military?
Absolutely. It was a really contingent process, and I think we lose that now. 75 years later, we lose a sense. We tend to think of it as inevitable, that this is just the arc of social progress, that it just happens, when it was absolutely not the case in 1948. And so President Truman, and I was really honored and fortunate to attend a seminar last week sponsored by the Truman Library and Foundation here in D.C., getting into the historical context of the executive order. And one of the key things that came out of that discussion was the incredibly contingent nature of this executive order. So it's 1948. Truman is up for re-election, his only re-election to office, and he is right on a knife's edge of being re-elected as the president. And so he's under immense pressure to make decisions to keep a political coalition together. And so there's a lot of politics behind this, but the real incident that sparked this change of heart in Harry Truman, who was the son and grandson of slaveholders, came from Missouri, a slave state. The true incident that changed his mind and his heart was the wounding and the blinding of an Army sergeant, Isaac Woodard, who had returned from service in the Pacific, was going home after being demobilized in his uniform on a bus home to South Carolina from Georgia, when he asks to leave the bus to use the bathroom at a stop. The bus driver pulled him off the bus, attempted to have him arrested when the chief of police in the town beat him so severely that he was blinded. This became national news, and it became national outrage. And when Truman, when the president saw this, and he saw the photographs of the blinded Sergeant Woodard, he became enraged, and he said, something has to stop. And he became committed to this effort to issue an executive order, to take executive action, because he knew that Congress would not. And so he was responding to events, he was responding to political pressure, but he was also responding to moral pressure to take the right step. And so that context behind it contains equal parts moral inspiration and political calculation, but it does tell us that there's never a wrong time to do the right thing. And so, but that executive order was merely the initial policy step that leads us toward integration. And in terms of the U.S. Army's history, what really kicks us over the top, of course, again, is combat in the Korean War and the need to fully utilize all our resources to take that step and to create an army that lives up to our ideals as a nation.
Just time for a couple more questions here, gentlemen, and then I'll give you the opportunity if you have any final thoughts or messages you'd like to pass along. Mr. Freeman, as people watch this documentary, what is it that you hope they take away most from this?
It's a realization that's embedded here that we didn't just start. We've been doing this all along. Lack of recognition does not do anything to deny the history. The history is there. So the pride of being American will grip us all.
And then my final question, I'll start with you, Mr. Freeman, but certainly any of you feel free to jump in. As you learned about the 761st and the men who served in that unit, in your mind, who were the champions here? Who were the folks that really drove that unit forward and enabled it to accomplish?
George Creasy was one. He was any children in here?
They're watching on TV, sir.
Oh, okay.
Warren
Warren was his name?
Warren.
I think it was Warren G.H.
Oh, it may have been GH.
That's right.
Yeah, right.
Few names.
He had a reputation for being a terror. I mean, an absolute terror. His story is the one I'm looking to tell in a movie. Like we do a series. I want to do a series like Band of Brothers about the 761st and their exploits. And this guy's going to stand out.
What did they call him? The baddest?
The baddest man in the 761st.
Yeah, I mean the baddest of the bad. Yeah. Worse than, meaner than a junkyard dog.
He witnessed his friend being killed in battle, and it just turned something in him, apparently. I think one of our historians called him a homicidal avenger. He just got his kicks out of killing Nazis.
Yeah.
Sounds like something from a Tarantino movie.
So far be it from me to really I'm certainly not a deep expert on the battalion and its soldiers, and you all are. I just want to mention another interesting member of the 761st, Lieutenant Jackie Robinson. So Jackie Robinson had gone to officer candidate school, commissioned after his white counterparts, of course, as an Army officer, and was assigned to Camp Hood to the 761st when he had his moment, and he didn't make it to combat because of that moment. He was riding on a bus after a medical appointment, was ordered to move to the back of the bus, and refused. And so he was moved to a different unit, court-martialed. He was acquitted by an all-white jury of officers, and remained in the Army but didn't deploy overseas. But as we talked about, and sir, as you talk about in the documentary, these men took their wartime experiences with them into the civil rights movement. And of course, we know Jackie Robinson as a path breaker on the ball field, but he was formed by that experience. And so I would consider him as a member of that battalion too, and as a very bad man.
I would go so far as to point out their colonel, White Colonel Paul Bates, who actually refused to court-martial Jackie, which compelled them to transfer him out of that unit into another one. But Paul Bates, like in any other situation, was a true ally to these men, treated them like men, gave them the courage and honor that they deserved, and they fought valiantly in large part because of his leadership. And in spite of it, because he was wounded early on and removed from the theater of war for a time, and these men went on fighting. And so I would acknowledge Colonel Paul Bates, and not just because he's a Rutgers man like me, but he was quite valiant.
Just the last thing I would say is I also think it's worth acknowledging the incredible, the fact that the 761st carried on fighting for 4 decades after the war, that the community that they came back, they formed this incredibly tight community. They fought for their own recognition, many of them, actively for decades. And their children, offspring now, are still part of that family. So they are bonded together by their experience for those 183 days in battle, made a family that still endures to this day.
That's fantastic.
If I could just make a comment. I'm doing, in the course of doing some research for a project that I'm doing, a doctoral dissertation I'm writing, I encountered the records and the personal effects of Clifford Alexander, who was the first black Secretary of the Army. And I got a chance to meet his widow, Adele, and she showed me his series of photo albums from his tenure as Secretary of the Army. And one of the photographs in that album was the ceremony in which the 761st was awarded the President's Unit Citation, and he presided at that ceremony. And that photo is going to go in my dissertation because it speaks to what Secretary Austin spoke to, which is the process in the Army of raising people to leadership positions. And when people in the force see their leaders who look like them and have the same experiences as them, they're inspired to serve. And you can't discount the impact of one person's actions. And Secretary Alexander was raised to that position by the executive order, by this process of inclusion, and he paid it back. And he was in a position to recognize these men for their service and sacrifice.
Well, thank you all. I am cognizant of your time today, and I do want to give Mr. Freeman the last word. So let me just start with Mr. Bowery, and we'll just go around the room here if you had any last messages or thoughts for the audience today.
So we've got a lot more material at my organization's website, history.army.mil, and you can explore all of this in great depth, in detail, but it's my honor to be with you today. Thank you.
I would be remiss if I didn't tell you you could find this documentary on the History Channel on August 20th at 8 p.m. So please tell your friends and family. And I would deeply like to acknowledge just gratitude and respect for the History Channel family, Eli Lehrer and Jen Wagman, who are here, gave everything to this project. They were equally storytellers as we were. So I just want to share a debt of gratitude with the History Channel for taking on this endeavor.
Thank you, Phil. I just said the same thing to History Channel, to Phil. Thank you, Phil, for coming aboard and really making this project a personal passion of yours and digging up all the information you did about the 761st and about Morgan's family, long buried information. So yeah, I just want to say again, thank you to Morgan for agreeing to put yourself in this film. I know you don't like to always be on camera, although I think you've been in a couple of things before. So
Well,
yeah.
my basic concept of myself is that I am an itinerant actor. Not much more than that. So to be in this position is a little mind-boggling, you know. I always want to say, look, Ma, you know. It's an honor. I never expressed any pride of being in uniform because I didn't do anything. But I did wear it. So.
Well, gentlemen, the honor is indeed ours. Mr. Freeman, thank you so much to all of you on behalf of Secretary Austin and the men and women of the Department of Defense. We're very grateful for you sharing your time and your gifts with us today, and for helping to tell this really important story about the 761st Tank Battalion. Thank you all for being here. Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That concludes our engagement.